Responsive web design is a technique that uses CSS media queries to adapt the layout of a web page in response to the size of the browser viewport or other features of the device being used to view the page. For example, this is an adaptation of the Pacific Highway case study used in previous lessons. The original design was fixed width, but if I resize the browser window, you can see that the hero image is also resizing. And when I get to a particular stage, the menu changes, and if I scroll down, you can see that the layout has also changed to be more suited to a tablet. If I continue reducing the size of the browser window, it changes again so that this is more suited to a layout for a mobile phone. I created this version using Dreamweaver's Fluid Grid layout, and in this lesson I want to give you a broad overview of how to work with Fluid Grid layouts. The rest of the chapter will go through the various steps in more detail. Although Fluid Grid layouts aren't particularly difficult to use, you do need a good understanding of HTML and CSS. Getting the HTML structure right is the key to success. So let's switch to Dreamweaver. And in Dreamweaver I've created a new site called Fluid Grid Layout, and this is the finished version. You can find the files in the Fluid Style folder, in the Styling a Fluid Grid Layout folder of the Responsive Web Design folder of the course assets. In the document window I've selected this icon at the bottom here, mobile size 480 by 800. And you can see that there are 4 columns which are for the layout grid. If I select the next icon, tablet size, there are 9 layout columns, and if I select desktop size, there are 12. You define the grid in the New Document dialog box, so if I go to File, New, and then select Fluid Grid Layout, this is where you define the number of columns that you want. By default, Dreamweaver has 4 for mobile, 8 for tablet, and 12 for desktop. You can also choose how wide you want the design to go. I deal with this in more detail in a separate lesson, so I'm just going to click Cancel. You create the structure of a Fluid Grid layout using the Insert panel and the Structure section. But with the Fluid Grid guides turned on, this panel works differently than in an ordinary page. So if I select Div, it opens this much simpler dialog box. Every Fluid element must either have a class or an ID, and Insert as Fluid element is selected by default. The reason Fluid elements need a class or an ID is because Dreamweaver automatically creates 3 style rules for each element. 2 of the style rules are wrapped in media queries, so they apply only to tablet layout or to desktop layout. If you deselect this checkbox, no style rules are created for the element. The other thing to notice is that there's no option to determine where to insert the element. The element is automatically inserted immediately after the currently selected one. I don't want to add a div at the moment, so I'm just going to click Cancel. The advantage of creating Fluid layout elements is that you can snap them to the grid. Let's just scroll down, and I'll select this element here. And with my cursor inside this element, I've got this handle on the right hand side which says Resize Article Intro, and if I drag that handle I can then see the number of columns that it will fit into, release my mouse, and it automatically snaps to the grid. And on the left hand side there is a Shift handle, and I can then shift the element 1 column in, so it's now centered with 1 column on either side. But if I select this tablet icon down here, you can see that that same element still occupies the full width. So by selecting these icons down here and snapping elements to the grid, you can create completely different layouts for mobile, tablet, and desktop. Of course, you're limited by the capabilities of HTML and CSS. The layout is achieved through a combination of floating elements and setting very precise margins. Let's just go back to the desktop layout and let's look at these icons up here. The arrows at the top and the bottom will swap the position with the next item. But if you move one of the items, it will affect all the layouts because you're affecting the underlying HTML. This eye icon here hides the element. Basically what it does is it sets the display property to none. This up arrow, move upper row, basically floats the element. You can also duplicate an element or delete it. And at the bottom right, this padlock, it says lock article. Basically what it does is it sets its position to absolute. Personally, I don't see much value in setting elements to absolute positioning inside a fluid grid layout, but that's what it's for. Now let's just scroll down a little bit, and I need to select one of these elements that's floated. And with a floated element, you have a down arrow which says starts new row, and what that does is it basically adds the clear property to the element. One thing that you need to be aware of is that if you use this eye icon to hide an element, in other words to set its display property to none, there is no way of redisplaying it within a fluid grid layout. You need to go directly into the CSS and reset the display property to block. And when you've finished with all the layout, you can then turn off the guides by clicking this icon up here, and then Design View and Live View work in the normal way. So those are the basics of working with fluid grid layouts. Dreamweaver automatically creates 3 style rules for each fluid element, 2 inside media queries and 1 outside. Snapping fluid layout elements to the guide columns automatically calculates the correct widths and margins using precise percentages.